Aella didn't become strong in a single moment, and she didn't wake up one day suddenly understanding life. Her awareness came slowly, like a shadow stretching across the ground at sunset, unnoticed at first, but impossible to ignore once it covered everything. There was a time when she believed that if she just endured long enough, something would shift, something would reward her quiet persistence. She thought maybe life had a hidden balance, an invisible system that eventually corrected itself, that pain would be compensated, that effort would be seen. But the longer she lived, the more she realized that belief wasn't truth, it was comfort. And comfort, she learned, can be one of the most dangerous illusions. Her days weren't dramatic, but they were heavy. The kind of heavy that doesn't come from one big problem, but from 1,000 small ones stacking on top of each other until breathing itself feels like effort. It was the repetition that drained her, the same struggles, the same uncertainty, the same feeling of moving without arriving. She would wake up with determination, telling herself that today might be different, that maybe something would finally click, but by the end of the day, that hope would quietly dissolve into the same unanswered silence. What made it harder wasn't the struggle itself, it was the lack of recognition. Not from others, but from life. It felt as if she was pouring everything she had into something that gave nothing back. Like speaking into a void that absorbed her voice without echo. And over time, that silence began to shape her thoughts in ways she didn't notice at first. She started questioning her own worth, not in obvious ways, but subtly. She wondered if maybe she wasn't doing enough, or if she wasn't enough. Maybe there was something missing in her, something others had that she didn't. Maybe life wasn't unfair, maybe she just wasn't built for it. Those thoughts didn't arrive all at once, they slipped in quietly, disguised as logic, dressed as self-reflection. And that's how doubt works, it doesn't shout, it convinces. But Aella wasn't weak. She was tired. There's a difference, and she didn't understand it at first. Weakness gives up. Tiredness questions. Weakness stops. Tiredness hesitates. And Aella, despite everything, never truly stopped. Even on the days when her energy felt drained, when her thoughts felt heavier than her body, when even the idea of trying again felt exhausting, she still moved, even if only slightly. And that small movement, that refusal to completely collapse, was something she didn't give herself credit for. One night, sitting alone in a dimly lit space with nothing but her thoughts, she confronted a truth she had been avoiding. She realized she had been living in expectation, expecting life to respond to her effort, expecting fairness to appear eventually, expecting things to make sense. And those expectations were the very things breaking her. Because life doesn't operate on expectation. It operates on reality. And reality doesn't adjust itself to match what we think should happen. That realization hit her hard, not like a sudden shock, but like a slow, undeniable weight pressing down on her chest. For a moment, she felt something close to defeat, as if everything she had believed in had quietly collapsed. If life wasn't fair, if effort didn't guarantee results, if patience didn't promise relief, then what was the point? It was a dangerous question. Because if answered the wrong way, it could end everything she had been holding on to. She sat with that question longer than she had ever sat with any thought before. She didn't run from it. She didn't distract herself. She let it exist, raw and uncomfortable. And in that stillness, something unexpected happened, not clarity, not motivation, but honesty. The point, she realized, wasn't fairness. The point was control. Not control over outcomes, because that was never guaranteed, but control over herself. Her actions. Her mindset. Her persistence. The only thing life couldn't take from her was her ability to keep going, to choose effort even when results were uncertain. And suddenly, everything shifted, not externally, but internally. She stopped looking at life as something that needed to validate her. She stopped waiting for a sign that she was on the right path. She stopped measuring her worth by what she gained and started measuring it by what she endured. And endurance became her identity. But that didn't mean things got easier. In fact, the next phase of her life felt even more intense, because now she was fully aware. There was no illusion left to soften the edges of reality. She saw things clearly, the randomness of success, the unpredictability of outcomes, the way some people seemed to rise effortlessly while others struggled endlessly. It would have been easy to become bitter. And for a brief moment, she did feel it, that quiet, dangerous bitterness creeping in, whispering that none of this was worth it, that trying without guarantees was pointless, that maybe she should just stop caring. That maybe life didn't deserve her effort. But Aella caught that thought before it could take root. Because she understood something crucial, bitterness doesn't punish life. It punishes you. So instead of letting that feeling grow, she redirected it. Not into forced positivity, not into fake optimism, but into something real, discipline. If life wasn't going to be fair, then she would be consistent. If outcomes weren't guaranteed, then effort would be non-negotiable. If nothing made sense, then she would create her own structure within the chaos. And that's when her mindset began to transform in a way that wasn't visible to anyone else. She stopped reacting emotionally to every setback. Not because she didn't feel anything, but because she chose not to let those feelings control her direction. Failure became information, not identity. Delay became part of the process, not a sign to quit. And struggle became expected, not feared. This wasn't motivation. This was evolution. There were still hard days, many of them. Days when progress felt invisible. Days when effort felt wasted. Days when her mind tried to drag her back into old patterns of doubt and frustration. But now, she had something stronger than temporary feelings. She had perspective. And perspective changes everything. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" she began asking, "What does this require from me?" That single shift turned every obstacle into a challenge rather than a punishment. It gave her a sense of direction in a world that offered none. She no longer needed life to be fair. She only needed herself to be unbreakable. And slowly, quietly, without any dramatic moment of victory, Aella began to build something within herself that no external circumstance could destroy, a foundation of resilience so strong that even when everything around her felt uncertain, she remained steady. Not perfect. Not always confident. But steady. And in a life that never promised fairness, that steadiness became her greatest strength. Aella didn't notice the exact moment when endurance stopped feeling like strength and started feeling like weight, but she felt the shift. It was subtle at first, like carrying something that didn't seem heavy until you realized you had been holding it for too long. Her discipline remained intact, her routine still in place, her effort consistent, but internally, something was changing. She was no longer fighting life. She was absorbing it. And absorption, over time, becomes pressure. The kind of pressure that doesn't explode outward, but compresses inward, tightening around your thoughts, your energy, your sense of direction. It wasn't that she was failing, it was that nothing seemed to move. She was still showing up, still doing everything she believed she was supposed to do, but the results remained distant, almost like they existed in another version of reality she couldn't access. That's when frustration returned, but this time, it was different. It wasn't loud or emotional. It didn't push her to react or lash out. It sat quietly beneath everything she did, like a constant background noise she couldn't turn off. A low, persistent question, what if none of this changes anything? That question followed her everywhere. Not as fear, but as possibility. And possibility, when negative, can be more dangerous than certainty. Because certainty, even if painful, gives you something solid to stand on. But possibility? It leaves you suspended between hope and doubt, never fully grounded in either. Aella continued moving, but now every step carried that invisible weight. Every action came with a silent challenge, is this worth it? Every effort felt like a test with no clear result. And slowly, even her sense of progress began to blur. She could no longer tell if she was moving forward, or just refusing to stop. And that distinction began to matter. Because refusing to stop is survival. But moving forward is growth. And for the first time, she wasn't sure which one she was doing. There were days when her energy dropped so low that even the smallest tasks felt like climbing something steep and endless. Not because they were difficult, but because she had nothing left to give them. She wasn't physically exhausted, she was mentally drained from carrying effort without evidence. It's one of the hardest things to do. To keep investing in something that hasn't paid you back. To keep believing in a process that hasn't proven itself yet. To keep building when there's no visible structure forming. And that's where most people break, not at failure, but at the absence of results. Aella reached that space fully. There was a night, quiet, still, heavier than usual, when everything inside her slowed down. She wasn't overthinking. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't even particularly sad. She was empty. Not in a hopeless way. In a stripped-down way. All the noise was gone. All the expectations, the pressure, the need for answers, it all faded, leaving behind something raw and unfiltered. And in that emptiness, she saw herself clearly. Not as someone strong. Not as someone struggling. Just, someone continuing. And for the first time, she asked herself a question without fear of the answer: if nothing changes, will I still keep going? There was no immediate response. No instinctive yes. No emotional reaction. Just silence. And that silence mattered. Because it forced her to confront the truth without any influence from motivation or fear. Minutes passed. Then more. And slowly, the answer came, not from emotion, but from something deeper. Yes. Not because she believed things would get better. Not because she expected a reward. Not because she was trying to prove something. But because stopping would mean becoming someone she didn't recognize. And that mattered more than any result. That was the shift. Not a breakthrough. Not a victory. A redefinition. Aella stopped tying her effort to outcomes completely. Not partially. Not conditionally. Completely. She removed the idea that what she was doing needed to work in a visible way. She stopped needing proof. Stopped needing signs. Stopped needing reassurance that she was on the right path. Because she realized something most people never fully accept: there is no clear, right path. There is only the path you commit to, and the way you walk it. From that point on, her effort became different. It became quieter. More focused. Less emotional. She didn't push harder, she pushed steadier. There were no bursts of motivation anymore. No highs of excitement. No emotional peaks that made her feel unstoppable. Instead, there was consistency so calm it almost felt invisible. She became someone who showed up without thinking about it. Who acted without questioning every move. Who continued without needing to feel ready. And that kind of consistency is dangerous, in the best way. Because it doesn't rely on anything external. It can't be easily shaken. Life still tested her. Of course it did. More delays. More uncertainty. More moments where things didn't go her way. But now, those moments didn't feel personal. They didn't feel like obstacles placed in her path. They just existed. And she moved through them. Not around them. Not away from them. Through them. There's a quiet power in that. The kind that doesn't look impressive from the outside. But changes everything internally. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to build, not in her circumstances, but in her presence. She carried herself differently. Not confidently in a loud way. But solid. Grounded. Unaffected by small disruptions. Unafraid of slow progress. Unmoved by temporary setbacks. She stopped reacting. And started responding. That's a level most people never reach. Because it requires letting go of control over outcomes entirely. And trusting only one thing: your ability to continue. Aella no longer needed life to cooperate. She no longer needed things to align. She no longer needed proof that her effort mattered. Because she had become someone who mattered to herself, regardless of what happened around her. And that kind of self-definition is unshakable. But even then, she wasn't finished. Because the final stage wasn't about endurance anymore. It was about transformation. Not just surviving unfairness. Not just dealing with it. But rising above it in a way that changes how you exist entirely. And that was still coming. Aella didn't realize when survival turned into control, because the change didn't come with a moment, it came with consistency so quiet it blended into her existence. There was no single victory, no clear shift where life suddenly became manageable or fair, no instant where everything aligned and rewarded her for everything she had endured. Instead, there was a slow, steady transformation that reshaped the way she thought, the way she reacted, and most importantly, the way she existed within a world that had never once promised her anything. The chaos around her didn't disappear, the uncertainty didn't fade, and the unfairness didn't correct itself, but something inside her stopped resisting all of it, and that was where her real power began. She no longer carried expectations like a burden she needed life to fulfill. There was no silent hope waiting in the background of her effort, no hidden belief that things would eventually balance out. She had let that go completely, not in a defeated way, but in a deliberate one. Because she understood now that expectation had been the source of her frustration, not the lack of results. Once she removed that, something unexpected replaced it, not emptiness, but clarity. A sharp, grounded awareness that her role in life was not to wait for fairness, but to function regardless of its absence. And that clarity made her steady in a way she had never been before. Her days became simpler, but not easier. She moved with intention, not urgency. She acted without needing emotional momentum. There was no longer a need to feel inspired or ready or confident before taking action. She had trained herself to move without those conditions. And that is where most people fail, she realized. They wait for the right feeling before they act, while life continues moving without them. But Aella had stepped beyond that pattern. She acted because action had become part of her identity, not something dependent on her mood or circumstances. And once identity takes over, hesitation loses its power. There was a quiet discipline in everything she did now, something almost unnoticeable from the outside but deeply unshakable within. She no longer rushed progress, no longer measured her growth in visible outcomes, no longer needed reassurance that she was moving in the right direction. Because she had come to understand that direction isn't proven by results, it's proven by consistency. And consistency, when maintained long enough, builds something far more reliable than temporary success. It builds trust in yourself. Not hope, not belief, but trust. The kind that doesn't question whether you'll continue, it already knows you will. And that trust changed the way she experienced everything. Setbacks still came, but they no longer interrupted her. Delays still existed, but they no longer frustrated her. Failure still appeared, but it no longer defined her. Because none of those things had the authority they once held. They were no longer signals to stop or doubt or question everything, they were simply part of the process she had fully accepted. She didn't label them as negative anymore. She didn't fight them or try to avoid them. She moved through them with the same steadiness she applied to everything else. There was a calmness in her now, but it wasn't softness. It wasn't comfort or ease or relief. It was control. The kind of control that comes from understanding that while life itself cannot be shaped to your will, your response to it always can. And once you master that response, nothing external holds the same power over you again. That realization didn't just change how she handled struggle, it changed how she defined strength. Strength, she saw now, wasn't about pushing harder or enduring more in a visible way. It was about remaining stable when instability was constant. It was about continuing without needing proof. It was about standing firm in your identity even when nothing around you reflects it back. She began to notice how different she had become, not through comparison with others, but through comparison with her past self. The version of her that once questioned everything, that once needed answers, that once searched for fairness and struggled to understand why things weren't working. That version had felt lost, uncertain, weighed down by the unpredictability of life. But now, she didn't feel lost anymore. Not because she had all the answers, but because she no longer needed them. The need to understand everything had been replaced by the ability to handle anything. And that shift was more powerful than clarity could ever be. There was a moment, quiet and ordinary, when she paused, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she felt something unfamiliar. Not doubt, not frustration, not exhaustion. Stability. A deep, grounded sense that no matter what happened next, she would be able to face it without losing herself. And that realization didn't excite her, it anchored her. Because she understood how rare that was. To reach a point where outcomes no longer controlled your mindset, where uncertainty no longer weakened your steps, where effort no longer depended on reward. That was something she had built slowly, painfully, and completely on her own. And then, without announcement, the results began to appear, not as dramatic success, not as overwhelming change, but as quiet progress that confirmed everything she had endured. Things that once felt distant started to come within reach. Situations that once confused her became manageable. Decisions that once overwhelmed her became clear. It wasn't because life had suddenly decided to cooperate, it was because she had become capable enough to navigate it effectively. And that distinction mattered more than anything else. Because it meant she was no longer dependent on circumstances aligning, she was equipped to handle them regardless of how they appeared. She didn't celebrate in a loud or emotional way. There was no sense of, finally, or relief from everything she had been through. Instead, there was understanding. A deep, grounded awareness that this quiet progress, this steady movement forward, was the result of everything she had done when nothing was working. Every moment she chose to continue when stopping would have been easier. Every time she showed up without proof that it mattered. Every decision to remain disciplined when doubt made quitting feel logical. All of it had led here, not to perfection, not to a flawless life, but to progress that was real, earned, and stable. And even then, she didn't slow down. Because her goal had changed. It was no longer about reaching something. It was about maintaining who she had become. Because she understood that becoming strong is one phase, but staying strong requires the same level of discipline that built it. She didn't want temporary growth. She wanted permanence. A way of living that didn't collapse under pressure, that didn't depend on circumstances, that didn't fade when things got hard again. So she continued, just as steady, just as focused, just as grounded as before. Not chasing. Not waiting. Not hoping. Building. Always building. And in that continuous movement, she reached the final realization that completed everything she had learned. Life had never changed. It was still unfair. Still unpredictable. Still indifferent. The only thing that had changed was her relationship with it. She no longer saw unfairness as something that needed to be corrected. She saw it as something that needed to be outgrown. And she had outgrown it. Not by escaping it, but by becoming stronger than its impact. And that is where true freedom exists. Not in a life without struggle. But in a mind that is no longer controlled by it. Aella didn't need life to be fair anymore. She didn't need it to make sense. She didn't need it to reward her. Because she had built something far more powerful than fairness. She had built herself. Completely. Unshakably. Relentlessly. And now, no matter what life brought next, delay, failure, uncertainty, or even success, she would meet it the same way. Calm. Steady. Unbreakable. Because she was no longer someone trying to survive an unfair world. She was someone who had mastered how to live in it. And that is the kind of strength nothing can take away.